Welcome back. And a very interesting presentation to come, I believe. This is Jonathan Evans, Associate Vicar of Partnership Development at St Martin in the Fields from London. And the name of the presentation is A Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, well, following on from Michelle's fascinating presentation, we're going to stay with pop culture. I'm going to try and reflect on the theme of the apocalypse in the songs and music of Bob Dylan. I was born in 1941, Bob Dylan reminded his audience at a concert in 2009. That was the year they bombed Pearl Harbor. I've been living in a world of darkness ever since. I wonder what he might have meant by that, bearing in mind that as a child he grew up in Hibbing, Minnesota, which has been described as being a perfectly fine, respectable, middle-class, civic pride sort of place, conventional, mainstream, solid, most of all quiet. One thing that he might have meant was that in the Cold War days when he was growing up, in addition to the normal fire and tornado drills you had from time to time to crawl under your desk in order to shield yourself from the imagined explosion of an atomic bomb. In Chronicles, his biographical book, Dylan writes that in 1951 I was going to grade school. One of the things we were trained to do was to hide and take cover under our desks when the air raid sirens blew, because the Russians could attack us with bombs. We were also told that the Russians could be parachuting from planes over our town at any time. Andrew McCarran notes that in Dylan's case, the terrifying experience of hearing the air raid sirens as a 10-year-old and having to take cover under his desk left a lasting mark on himself as a person and his work. McCarran goes on to say that of his childhood and its anxieties, Dylan writes in Chronicles, "Back then, when something was wrong, the radio could lay hands on you and you'd be all right." Dylan's most steadfast sense of identity was guided by the imaginative worlds that came to life through the blues, gospel, Appalachian and country music that he heard on the radio and ended up playing himself. Howard Soons has noted that his musical influences included gospel, and that much of the American folk and blues music that proved to be so formative for him was also infused with biblical imagery as well. Much later, Dylan was to state that those old songs are my lexicon and prayer book. All my beliefs come out of those old songs, literally anything from "Let me rest on that peaceful mountain" to "Keep on the sunny side." You can find all my philosophy in those old songs, he said. I believe in a God of time and space, but if people ask me about that, my impulse is to point them back towards those songs. I believe in Hank Williams singing, "I saw the light. I've seen the light too." So there's a real sense in which it was religion that gave the young Robert Zimmerman a language in which to express his sense of living in a world gone wrong. But Cartwright argues that Dylan first explored the Bible's apocalyptic imagery from an artistic perspective of potent symbol, and then later, as a result of his Christian conversion, adopted a quite literal understanding of the way God would get even with, and then with his chosen few prevail. Dylan's knowledge of the Bible, of course, came from his Jewish upbringing, as well as from the music that he listened to. Soons notes that while Bob was not brought up in an Orthodox home, he did receive a grounding in the Bible, an important source of imagery for his song lyrics long before his Christian conversion of the 1970s. And Cartwright expands, writing that his understanding of history wells up from the depths of a Jewish heritage that rehearsed each year within the family the liberating exodus of God's people from bondage. It was that understanding of history embedded deep in Dylan's Jewish heritage that then haunts him with questions of justice in the face of a growing despair for the human transformation of the world. But there's one more key influence to explore, again, musical as you would expect. In September 1960, Bob Dylan borrowed a copy of Woody Guthrie's autobiography, Bound for Glory, from a college classmate and became obsessed. Dylan started mimicking his hero's speech patterns and even told the crowd at the Café Wa when he arrived in New York for the first time the following January, I've been travelling around the country following in Woody Guthrie's footsteps. Dylan hunted Guthrie out at Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, where he was suffering from Huntington's disease, which finally led to Guthrie's death in 1967. And Dylan wrote and played to his idol a new piece of his own called Song to Woody, which states that Hibbing, Minnesota's Bobby Zimmerman had escaped his past to reinvent himself as a lonesome hobo drifter, like Guthrie, like the best folk singers, hopping off and on railroad cars, destination anywhere. I'm out here 1,000 miles from my home, walking a road other men have gone down. I'm seeing your world of people and things, your paupers and peasants and princes and kings. Hey, Woody Guthrie, I wrote you a song about a funny old world that's a-coming along. Seems sick and it's hungry, it's tired and it's torn. It looks like it's a-dying and it's hardly been born. Now, Ross Altman writes that listening to that first published Dylan song today, written when he was just 20 years old, one is struck by how world-weary the young troubadour already sounds, as he evokes a world that seems sick and it's hungry, tired and torn, that looks like it's a-dying, but it's hardly been born. And I think when you put all of those influences together, it becomes clear that what we have in the best of Dylan's work is a contemporary Pilgrim, Dante or Rimbaud, going on a compassionate journey undertaken in the eye of the apocalypse to stand with the damned at the heart of the darkness that is 20th century culture. It's there at the beginning in Song to Woody, and it's still there in Ain't Talking, the last track on what is to date the penultimate set of original Bob Dylan songs. Ain't talking, just walking through this weary world of woe, heart burning, still yearning, no one on earth would ever know. Ain't talking, just walking up the road, round the bend, heart burning, still yearning, in the last outback at the world's end. That was the slide that should have accompanied those. But in between those two markers, Song to Woody and Ain't Talking, Dylan's songs document where his pilgrim journey in the eye of the apocalypse has taken him, often with the imagery of storms lighting his way. He's travelled the paths of political protest, urban surrealism, country contentment, gospel conversion and world-weary blues. On his journey, we can say he saw 7 breezes blowing around the cabin door where victims despair in the ballad of Hollis Brown, lightning flashing for those who are confused, accused and misused in chimes of freedom. He surveyed Desolation Row, talked truth with a thief as the wind began to howl in All Along the Watchtower, sheltered with an unnamed woman from the apocalyptic storm in Shelter from the Storm, felt the idiot wind blowing through the buttons on his coat, recognised himself as an idiot and felt sorry, found a pathway to the stars and couldn't believe that he'd survived in Where Are You Tonight, rode the slow train up around the bend, was driven out of town into the driving rain because of belief in I Believe in You, heard the ancient footsteps join him on his path in every grain of sand, felt the Caribbean winds fanning desire, bringing him nearer to the fire and Caribbean wind, betrayed his commitment, felt the breath of a storm and went searching for his first love in tight connection to my heart. And then, at the final moment, it's not quite dark yet, but he's walking through the middle of nowhere, trying to get to heaven, before the door is closed. The air is getting hotter. There's a rumbling in the skies. I've been wading through the high muddy water with the heat rising in my eyes. Every day your memory grows dimmer. It don't haunt me like it did before. I've been walking through the middle of nowhere, trying to get to heaven before they close the door. So I think, as Frank Davey writes, that Dylan's vision is essentially apocalyptic, and that again and again he tells of an evil world which is soon to be both punished and replaced tomorrow, perhaps when the ship comes in. Songs like When the Ship Comes In and The Times They Are A-Changing both deal with rapidly approaching change, which is described in apocalyptic terms. When the apocalyptic moment arrives, it is clear that some will be on the positive side of the change and others not. Dylan may well be speaking, as has been suggested by many critics, about young versus old and freedom versus rules, but on the basis of the lyrics themselves, it's not really possible to be definitive, because the language Dylan uses is deliberately unspecific. In neither of those songs does he identify the specific nature of the change that is to come, and it is that generality which gives these songs a universality and a continuing relevance, because they can be applied to different circumstances at different times. What can definitively be said about both songs, however, is that they are warnings about a coming apocalyptic change, and the warning concerns on which side of that change we will find or place ourselves. Cartwright suggests that in his early songs of protest, Dylan optimistically expressed a prophetic view of history in which an old order will fade, giving way to a more just and righteous existence. Then, with the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the disillusionment of good causes becoming easily corrupted, Dylan became markedly more pessimistic in his writing. And then, from Slow Train Coming onwards, Dylan equated the apocalypse with the imminent return of Christ, also of course known as the Second Coming. The return of Christ in judgment is the slow train that is coming up around the bend, and in the face of that apocalypse, he calls on human beings to wake up and strengthen the things that remain. According to his biographer Clinton Halin, this reflected the influence of Hal Lindsey through the Vineyard Fellowship, whose Bible classes he attended post-conversion. Halin writes that aside from the scriptures, the classes sought to provide a grounding in the works of Hal Lindsey, the man to whom God, in his infinite wisdom, had revealed the true code of revelation. Lindsay's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which was published in 1970, became Dylan's second Bible at this time and added an apocalyptic edge to his worldview, allowing Christ to come again to take precedence over Jesus the teacher. So, with a song like The Groom's Still Waiting at the Altar, Dylan sees the apocalypse coming as a curtain which is rising on a new age, but not yet here, with the groom, Christ, who awaits his bride, the church, still waiting at the altar. And in the time that remains, he calls on human beings to arise from our slumber. Dead man, when will you arise? Cobwebs in your mind, dust upon your eyes. In the light of this thread in Dylan's songs throughout this period, it seems consistent to also read Joker Man from Infidels as being another song in this vein, as a song depicting the apathy of humanity in the face of the apocalypse, and one which is shot through with apocalyptic imagery drawn from the book of Revelation. There is much in the song that is negative about humanity. We are born with a snake in both our fists. We rush in where angels fear to tread. Our future is full of dread. We are doing no more than keeping one step ahead of the persecutor within. We are going to Sodom and Gomorrah, only knowing the law of the jungle, the law of revenge from the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, an eye for an eye. But these negatives are not the whole story, as we also experience freedom, dance to the nightingale tune, fly high, walk on the clouds, and are a friend to the martyr. We have an inherent dignity and beauty to which only the greatest artists such as Michelangelo can do justice. In Joker Man, I think Dylan captures well the biblical portrait of humanity as made in the image of God, but marred by our rejection of God, with our potential for beauty and compassion perverted into a selfish search for self-aggrandizement. The final verse comes straight from the book of Revelation and describes the birth of the Antichrist, who will deceive humanity into following him rather than Christ. And the accusation and challenge that Dylan puts to us in the final lines of this final verse is that we know exactly what is happening. After all, it has all been prophesied in the book of Revelation. But we make no response. We are apathetic in the face of apocalypse. And our lack of response, he says, is what is fatal to us, because it is only through repentance and turning to Christ, as he believes at this phase in his career, that we will be saved from the coming judgment. These final lines are both an accusation and a challenge, because in line with the prophecy of Revelation, Dylan clearly believes that humanity as a whole will be apathetic and unresponsive. But they must also be a challenge, because if there is no possibility that any of us will respond, why write the song at all? Having said all that, for much of his career, whilst consistently writing in the face of a coming apocalypse, Dylan did not specifically equate that apocalypse with the imminent return of Christ. So apocalyptic change elsewhere in Dylan's work can be understood as generational conflict, Cold War conflicts, nuclear holocaust, civil rights struggles, and more. The generic message throughout, though, is that apocalyptic change in some form is coming, and we need to think where we stand in relation to it. And that perhaps is a message that is as relevant today in terms of economic meltdown, climate change, or peak oil as it is, or maybe, to the second coming, whether imminent or not. Dylan's manifesto, I think, for his work is the song Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall. A song about walking through a world which is surreal and unjust, and singing what he sees as he does so. I saw a newborn baby with wild wolves all around it. Saw a highway of diamonds with nobody on it. I saw a black branch with blood that kept dripping. I saw a room full of men with their hammers a-bleeding. I saw a white ladder all covered with water. I saw 10,000 talkers whose tongues were all broken. I saw guns and sharp swords in the hands of young children, and it's a hard, and it's a hard rains are gonna fall. John Gibbons has noted that by biblical analogy we take the flood to be a judgment upon all the things that have been listed in the verse, and for that reason a hard rain is going to fall. Now this, of course, is a song which has been interpreted as dealing with events that were contemporary to the time, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis and more generally the threat of a nuclear holocaust. And that, of course, may well be so. But I think a more straightforward interpretation, and one that is closer to what the lyrics actually say, is to see it as a statement by Dylan of what he is trying to do in and through his work. In the song, he walks through this surreal and unjust world. Ahead of him, he sees a gathering apocalyptic storm of some kind, as Gibbons notes, the biblical storm of judgment that is the flood. And he resolves to walk in the shadow of that storm and to sing out what it is that he sees. I'm a-going back out, for the rain starts a-falling. I'll walk to the depths of the deepest dark forest, where the people are many and their hands are all empty, where the pellets of poison are flooding their waters, where the home in the valley meets the damp, dirty prison, where the executioner's face is always well hidden, where hunger is ugly, where the souls are forgotten, where black is the colour where none is the number, and I'll tell it and think it and speak it and breathe it and reflect from the mountain so that all souls can see it. And 43 years later, with Ain't Talking, he's still writing songs where his central character is walking through an apocalyptic landscape. Ain't Talking reminds us of films such as The Road and The Book of Eli, where flawed figures seek to protect and enable the survival of goodness, whether a sun or a Bible, while travelling in violent, licentious, post-apocalyptic worlds. Ain't talking, just walking through this weary world of woe, heart burning, still yearning, no one on earth would ever know. They say prayer has the power to help, so pray from the mother. In the human heart an evil spirit can dwell. I'm trying to love my neighbour and do good unto others, but oh mother, things ain't going well. Ain't talking, just walking through the world mysterious and vague, heart burning, still yearning, walking through the cities of the plague. All my loyal and much loved companions, they approve of me and share my code. I practice a faith that's been long abandoned. Ain't no altars on this long and lonesome road. The suffering in this situation is unending. The fire's gone out, but the light is never dying. He challenges us to say that he can't still get heavenly aid. In the last outback, at the world's end, he walks in the mystic garden, talking with the woman at the tomb who mistook Christ as the gardener. His heart is still burning, still yearning for the coming judgment and the resurrection of the dead. In the liner notes for Telltale Signs, the writer Larry Sloman signs off with a paragraph quoting a myriad of Dylan's lyrics, which I think gives a useful end to this talk. He ain't talking, but he's still walking, heart burning, still yearning. He's trampling through the mud, through the blistering sun, getting damp from the misty rain. He's got his top hat on, ambling along with his cane, stopping to watch all the young men and young women in their bright-coloured clothes cavorting in the park. Despite all the grief and devastation he's seen on his odyssey, his heart isn't weary. It's light and free, bursting all over with affection for those who sailed with him. Deep down, he knows that his loyal and much-loved companions approve of him and share his code. And it's dawn now, the sun beginning to shine down on him, and his heart's still there in the highlands, over those hills far away. But there's a way to get there, and if anyone can, he'll figure it out. And in the meantime, he's already there in his mind, that mind decidedly out of time, and we're all that much richer for his journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
That's all right.
Questions for Jonathan? Anyone? Questions, comments? Yep. Harry.
I'm unashamed. It's a great talk.
Thank you.
No boasting now, but I knew Robert Zimmerman. I could never call him Bob Dylan. I know his family and his background in Hibbing, Minnesota. He comes from a department store, a very wealthy department store owning family. I'm sure you know that. And he came to New York to Izzy Young's Folklore Center. Izzy Young was one of the key figures in the socialist beatnik movement at the time. He introduced him to Allen Ginsberg and to Peter Orlovsky, his lover. That today they would be husband and husband. And he then went up to City College, which was then, and even now called the Harvard of Harlem on 136th Street, and he learned socialism and a form of New York communism that changed him completely from being the Woody Guthrie clone to being a little bit more urban. Because Woody Guthrie is also an outlier. In New York, we call them all outliers. Everybody shows up is. But he learned this urban socialism, and that the real woes of the world were not that the workers were being trod upon, is that the poor were ever with us. And that becomes for him, became a very Christian crusade. And he's often talked about his early socialism with Izzy Young. Izzy Young was a Swedish socialist, and he moved to Sweden married a Swedish woman, opened up the folklore center there. I think he's long dead, older man. But what is most interesting is that the Café Wa, which was this little dump downstairs that was psychedelic, paint on the walls, and every kind of entertainer was there. Even I performed there once. Was the center of the Greenwich Village communist, gay, beatnik, and evolving hippie community. And he felt that he was above that. He felt that he had risen above that. And I think after a period of time, he moved to Boyceville, which is just outside of Woodstock, to a house up in the mountains. And all the mountain stories are about this incredibly beautiful place in the Catskills, where he met some of the leading musicians of the day, Levon Helm and many others. And we've both seen, the references to him in every restaurant, every shop, all the people who knew him. Everybody, you get around and you get stoned and everybody's saying, like, well, it's not like when Bob was here, now it's just gentrifiers all over the place. And what this means is that the legend that you're talking about, which is this beautiful American, rebellious, but very empathetic legend, is over. It doesn't exist anymore. Now it's trends and fashions and social media. We've lost the string of what socialism can be, and instead replaced it with what Christianity has traditionally said it was, whether it is or not. And that's much too great a loss. Could you address that loss? Or else!
Could you repeat the question?
I'd be at a complete loss to know how to address that question, really. I mean, it's a huge kind of sociological question that you're asking, isn't it?
I wish I was a small thinker, but I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of Christianity that Dylan seemed to have adopted at the time of his specifically Christian conversion is a very narrow and a very kind of literal understanding of an interpretation of both of the scriptures and of the book of Revelation in particular. But I think there's a real sense in that while that was an obsession perhaps to him at that period of time, certainly a revelation to him, that in common with other obsessions and revelations at other stages in his career, it dominated for a period, and then he kind of absorbs it into a broader way of thinking that actually I think is more integrated in terms of both his Jewish heritage and the kind of Christian understandings that he came to at a later stage, and that maybe integrate too with the kind of socialism and communism that you were talking about from those early days in New York. So that by the time you get to an album like Infidels, which has Joker Man on it, you're getting a much more nuanced understanding of Christianity and of himself in relation to Christianity, and from that point on, there's less of the judgmentalism that there is on the specifically gospel albums, and more of a sense of flawed characters who are nevertheless retaining faith in the face of an apocalypse. I don't know if that's of any help in terms of a response.
Very much so.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Time for a quick question? No. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
That's all right.
Thank you.
Okay.